Is it the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Or is it maybe the most elaborate and brilliant forgery in all of human history? The Shroud of Turin, it's one of those mysteries that just never seems to go away. For centuries, science has tried and, honestly, failed to explain it. So today, we're going to walk through the scientific case for why it just might be the real thing.
The whole mystery really kicks into high gear back in 1898. A photographer gets permission to take a picture of the shroud, but when he goes to develop the negative plate, he sees something absolutely impossible: a perfect, positive image staring back at him. It turns out the shroud itself acts like a photographic negative, a technology that wouldn't be invented for another 18 centuries. And that's the question that's haunted scientists ever since. How on earth was this image created?
And that right there is the heart of the argument for its authenticity. This isn't just about faith. Proponents say it's about hard science. I mean, we're talking more than 500,000 hours of study by experts in over 100 different fields. And to this day, not a single person has been able to replicate the image or even explain how it was formed. So let's take a look at the evidence they point to.
First up, let's just talk about the image itself, because its physical properties are, well, they're baffling.
So for anyone who's not familiar with it, the shroud is this long, 14-foot piece of linen cloth, and on it you can just faintly make out the front and back image of a man who is very clearly crucified. Now, if you see it with your own eyes, the image is super subtle, almost like a faint scorch mark.
What's so wild is how this image justifies every known artistic method. The official Shroud of Turin research project, or STURP, they confirmed it. There are no pigments, no dyes, no paint, nothing. The image itself is unbelievably shallow. We're talking just a few microns deep on the very, very top fibers of the cloth. And here's the part that gets really weird. When scientists analyzed it with a device called a VP8 image analyzer, which basically translates light and dark into 3D shapes, the shroud revealed perfect topographical data. In other words, it contains 3D information. A painting or a photograph just can't do that. They're flat.
So if it's not a painting, how could it have been formed? Well, one of the leading theories comes from a team of Italian scientists. They propose it was created by a massive burst of radiant energy. Get this, 34,000 trillion watts, all released in a fraction of a billionth of a second. To put that in perspective, that is a burst of power so immense that our modern science can't even come close to recreating it over a large surface without just completely vaporizing the cloth.
Okay, but wait a minute. If the science is pointing to something that extraordinary, what about the famous 1988 carbon dating test? You know, the one that seemed to prove it was all just a medieval fake? Well, that brings us to the biggest challenge to the shroud's authenticity: the carbon dating controversy.
Back in 1988, the headline screamed that the mystery was finally solved. Radiocarbon dating on a tiny sample placed the cloth's origin somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. Case closed. Medieval forgery. But here's where it gets complicated. Proponents of the shroud argue the story isn't that simple. They point out that the raw data from that test was kept under wraps for almost 30 years, and when it was finally released, it showed some major problems.
The core argument against that famous test is this: the sample they tested was taken from a really bad spot. It was a corner of the cloth that had been expertly repaired by nuns after a big fire in 1532. Researchers say that this corner was interwoven with 16th century cotton, which would have totally skewed the results and made the cloth seem much, much younger. On top of that, they point to a flawed protocol and, of course, that suppressed data as major reasons to just dismiss the finding entirely.
All right, so if we set aside the carbon-14 test as unreliable, like the proponents argue, what other scientific clues do we have that might point to the shroud's true age and where it came from?
Well, they point to at least two other dating methods. One is called wide-angle X-ray scattering, which basically measures how linen naturally ages and decays on a molecular level. When scientists compare the shroud's linen to a cloth that we know is from the 1st century, they found a very similar degree of aging. Then there's the vanillin content. Vanillin is a chemical that's naturally in flax plants, but it disappears over time. The fact that there's no vanillin left on the shroud's fibers suggests it's way, way older than the medieval period.
And then you have the forensic evidence of where this cloth has been. Chemical analysis has identified pollen spores from plants that are unique to the Jerusalem area. And what's even crazier, some of these plants only bloom in the spring, right around the time of Passover. For supporters, this is a huge deal. I mean, how could some medieval forger in Europe possibly know to embed the cloth with specific, microscopic pollen from Jerusalem that only blooms at a certain time of year?
But maybe the most powerful piece of physical evidence connecting the shroud to 1st century Jerusalem actually comes from a completely separate artifact, the Sudarium of Oviedo.
So this is the Sudarium of Oviedo. It's a smaller face cloth, and it's believed to have been placed over the man's head right after he died on the cross. And here is the kicker. Its documented history traces it all the way back to at least the 6th century. That's 600 years before the earliest carbon dating estimate for the shroud.
And when you compare the two cloths forensically, the results are just staggering. The blood type on both is AB, which is a rare type but more common in Middle Eastern populations. The blood is post-mortem, and it's mixed with pulmonary edema fluid, which is consistent with death by asphyxiation on a cross. Both cloths share pollen from Jerusalem. And, most incredible of all, the wound and bloodstain patterns on the Sudarium match the face on the shroud in a perfect one-to-one correspondence.
So, moving beyond the cloth itself, what does the image tell us about the man who was wrapped inside it, and the very specific, brutal way he died? The anatomical details are just incredibly precise. You know, if you think about pretty much any painting of the crucifixion from any century, the nails are almost always shown going through the palms of the hands. It's just the standard artistic depiction.
But the shroud shows something totally different. The nail wound isn't in the palm, it's in the wrist. This is an absolutely mind-blowing detail because we now know, anatomically, that the palm of the hand could not support the weight of a body on a cross. The nail would just rip right through the flesh. A medieval forger would almost certainly have followed the artistic tradition, not this obscure medical fact. And it's the exact same story with the crown of thorns. Art always depicts it as a simple wreath, like a circlet, but the shroud shows over 50 different puncture wounds all over the scalp, consistent not with a headband, but with a full helmet of thorns. And this matches the kind of thorn bushes that are native to the Jerusalem area, which could easily be fashioned into a cap-like helmet.
And the list of medically and historically accurate details just keeps going. There are over 372 distinct wounds from a Roman flagrum, which was a brutal whip designed to literally tear flesh. There are abrasions and soil deposits on the shoulders, knees, and nose, exactly what you'd expect from someone falling while carrying a heavy beam. And then there's the side wound, pierced by a lance between the 5th and 6th ribs, which released a flow of separated blood and watery fluid, a post-mortem detail that's perfectly preserved on the cloth.
So what happens when you bring all these separate pieces of evidence together? Everything from botany and forensic pathology to art history and physics? What's the final verdict? Well, one mathematician at the University of Turin, Bruno Barberis, actually tried to calculate the probability. What are the odds of all these specific details, the pollen, the blood type, the 3D data, the historically accurate wounds, all appearing together by pure chance on a single artifact? His conclusion? The odds of the man on the shroud being anyone other than the historical Jesus of Nazareth are 1 in 200 billion. So in the end, proponents don't see the shroud as an object that defies science. They see it as an object that maybe points beyond science. They describe it as the natural effect of a supernatural event. Now, of course, this isn't proof, but it is a trail of physical evidence, from pollen to bloodstains to radiation burns, that has somehow survived for 2,000 years. And it leaves us with a pretty profound question. What do we do when the evidence itself seems to point beyond the limits of our physical world?